She gave everything she had to her daughter and ended up humiliated in her own home. When she sat on the couch, they told her coldly, "This is not your place." Days later, she was evicted like a burden, but what this grandmother did next shocked the entire family. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise that this will be the best story you will hear in your life. The autumn light filtered through Margaret Winter's small apartment window, illuminating her careful hands as they guided fabric through her sewing machine. At 72, her fingers still possessed the nimble precision that had defined her 40-year career as a seamstress. The rhythmic hum of the machine had been her companion through decades of life's symphony, through raising her daughter alone, through financial struggles, through moments of quiet triumph. Her retirement 3 years ago had brought a different rhythm to her days. The tiny one-bedroom apartment in East Hartford was modest but sufficient. She had downsized significantly 5 years earlier, selling her previous 2-bedroom home and using most of the proceeds to help her daughter Caroline and son-in-law Robert purchase their first house in a respectable neighborhood. It had been a substantial sum, nearly $70,000, almost everything Margaret had accumulated over her working life. "Mom, we'll never forget this," Caroline had said, eyes glistening as Margaret handed over the cashier's check. "This house will be your home too, always." Margaret had kept the transfer receipt tucked away in an old greeting card box, not out of suspicion, but as a tangible reminder of her contribution to her family's future. A legacy of sorts. The remaining money had been enough to secure this small apartment and maintain her independence, which Margaret treasured. Her days followed a gentle routine, morning coffee while watching the neighborhood come alive outside her window, tending to rescued plants that lined her modest balcony, organizing her collection of threads and fabrics stored in old cookie tins, and occasionally taking on small sewing jobs from neighbors. Everything had remained perfectly manageable until that Tuesday morning when her bathroom floor betrayed her. One misplaced step on the slick tile, a desperate grasp at empty air, and then searing pain as her hip fractured upon impact. The fall had changed everything. After surgery and a brief hospital stay, the doctor had been direct. "Mrs. Winters, you shouldn't be alone during your recovery. Do you have family who can help?" Caroline and Robert had offered their home without hesitation. "We have that spare room, Mom. It's perfect timing." Actually, the spare room had previously been a catch-all storage space, hastily converted with a twin bed, a small dresser, and a nightstand rescued from the basement. The walls remained an institutional beige, decorated only with a faded print of a landscape Margaret didn't recognize. Everything about the room whispered temporary. Margaret tried to make herself useful despite her healing hip. She woke before anyone else, quietly washing dishes left in the sink from the previous night, watering neglected houseplants, folding stray laundry. She moved like a ghost through the house, careful not to disturb the family's routines or spaces. Robert was unfailingly polite, the kind of politeness reserved for strangers or distant acquaintances. He asked about her hip at dinner, nodded at her responses, then redirected conversation to work matters or neighborhood gossip. Her 16-year-old grandson Michael retreated behind headphones whenever she entered a room, offering only the briefest acknowledgments of her presence. 14-year-old Emma offered occasional smiles, but seemed uncertain how to interact with the grandmother, who had suddenly become a household fixture. And then there was Caroline, her daughter, once a little girl who had sat beside Margaret's sewing machine for hours, learning stitches and sharing dreams. Now Caroline moved through the house with a clipboard efficiency, managing the household with unspoken rules and expectations that Margaret couldn't quite grasp. "We need structure with the kids' schedules," Caroline explained when Margaret had prepared breakfast too early. "And Robert likes his coffee made a specific way," she added, emptying the pot Margaret had brewed. The distance between them seemed to grow with each passing day. Margaret couldn't pinpoint exactly when their relationship had shifted from the warm mother-daughter bond she remembered to this strange, formal arrangement. Sometimes she caught Caroline looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something between obligation and resentment. 6 weeks into her stay, the delivery truck arrived. Two men struggled to maneuver an enormous cream-colored sectional sofa through the front door, while Caroline directed them with animated gestures. "It's perfect," Caroline exclaimed, once it dominated the living room. The designer said it would transform the space, and she was right. That evening, Caroline gathered the family to outline the rules for the new purchase. "This fabric requires special care. No eating on the sofa, no sitting on it when you're damp from the pool, and absolutely no lounging with shoes on." Margaret nodded along with the others, noting how the children rolled their eyes when Caroline wasn't looking. Robert studied his phone, occasionally murmuring agreement without looking up. The following afternoon, after washing a load of towels and fighting through the persistent ache in her hip, Margaret found herself alone in the living room. The house was quiet. Robert at work, the children at after-school activities, Caroline at her yoga class. The new sofa gleamed in the afternoon light, its pristine fabric almost luminescent against the hardwood floor. Margaret lowered herself carefully onto the edge of the sofa, just to rest for a moment before starting dinner preparations. The cushion yielded perfectly beneath her weight, cradling her tired body. She sighed, allowing herself to relax for the first time that day. "What are you doing?" Margaret startled at Caroline's sharp voice. She hadn't heard the garage door open or Caroline's footsteps. "I was just resting for a moment, dear. My hip was—" "Mom, I just explained yesterday about the sofa." Caroline's voice was tight, controlled. "This isn't an ordinary piece of furniture. It cost more than 3 months of your Social Security checks." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. That's not your place." The words fell like stones between them. Margaret looked up at her daughter, searching for some softness in her expression, some recognition. Instead, she found only irritation and something deeper, perhaps embarrassment. The realization struck Margaret with unexpected force. Her daughter was embarrassed by her presence in this carefully curated life. "You're right," Margaret said quietly, pushing herself up with careful dignity. "I'll be more mindful." She retreated to her temporary bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Sitting on the edge of the twin bed, Margaret was suddenly overwhelmed by memories of a small apartment years ago, where she had sewn dresses while young Caroline played nearby on their old plaid sofa, purchased on an installment plan. She remembered how Caroline would curl against her side as they watched television together, how they'd shared ice cream directly from the carton on that worn sofa, without concern for spills or stains. The contrast between that cherished memory and today's humiliation created an ache far deeper than her healing bone. Something fundamental had shifted, and Margaret suddenly understood that the fracture in her hip might heal completely. But this fracture between her and Caroline might never mend. That evening, dinner conversation flowed around Margaret as though she were invisible. When she offered to help with dishes, Caroline declined with a tight smile. "We have a system, Mum. It's easier if we just handle it." Margaret nodded and retreated once again to her room, where she sat by the window watching darkness settle over the neighborhood. Outside, porch lights blinked on one by one. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children completed homework at kitchen counters. Normal life continued everywhere except within these walls, where Margaret increasingly felt like an unwelcome ghost haunting her daughter's perfect home. The following days brought a thickening silence to the house. Margaret moved with increasing caution through spaces that felt more foreign with each passing hour. Caroline's words, "That's not your place," echoed in her mind during quiet moments, a constant reminder of her precarious position in this household. 3 weeks after the sofa incident, Margaret found an envelope slipped under her bedroom door one Tuesday morning. Inside was a formal letter on legal stationery. Her vision blurred as she read the typed words, "Notice of termination of temporary accommodation agreement." The letter, signed by both Caroline and Robert, stated she had 30 days to find alternative living arrangements, citing irreconcilable differences in living habits and strain on the household dynamic. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling more with each reading. They had hired a lawyer to evict her. Her own daughter had hired a lawyer rather than having a simple conversation. The clinical language transformed family into business, love into liability. She sat heavily on the bed, legal notice clutched in her hands. Through the window, she could see Caroline in the backyard, instructing a landscaper about flowerbed arrangements, gesturing with the same animated confidence she'd displayed with the sofa delivery men. How had they arrived at this point? Margaret opened her nightstand drawer and removed an old embroidered pouch where she kept important documents. Among Medicare cards and prescription information, she found what she was searching for, a bank receipt from 2018. The transfer of $68,750 to Caroline and Robert's account, with house down payment written in Margaret's neat handwriting in the memo line. Nearly everything she had. That evening, Margaret dialed a number she hadn't called in months. "Eleanor? It's Margaret Winters. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Eleanor Chen had been Margaret's friend for over 30 years, since they'd worked together at the downtown department store alterations department. Now widowed and living alone in a 2-bedroom house near the community college, Eleanor listened without interruption as Margaret explained her situation. "Margaret, this is outrageous," Eleanor finally said, her voice tight with indignation. "Pack your things. You're coming to stay with me until we figure this out." 3 days later, Robert helped load Margaret's few belongings into Eleanor's Toyota with mechanical efficiency. No mention was made of the eviction notice or the remaining 27 days. Caroline remained inside the house, apparently on an important work call. The children were at school, sparing everyone the awkwardness of formal goodbyes. As Robert handed Margaret her sewing machine, the last item to be loaded, he finally spoke directly to her. "Caroline feels this is for the best. She thinks you'll be happier with more independence." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She looked past him to the house her money had helped purchase, and silently said goodbye to the family she thought she knew. Eleanor's modest bungalow welcomed Margaret with unexpected warmth. A small bedroom with morning light streaming through gauzy curtains, a comfortable chair positioned near a window overlooking a garden of native perennials, the scent of fresh coffee and homemade bread. Most importantly, Eleanor's company, unhurried, genuine, respectful. "This room has been empty since my son moved to Oregon," Eleanor explained, helping Margaret arrange her clothes in the cedar dresser. "It does my old heart good to have it occupied again." Margaret set up her sewing machine near the window, unpacked her organized collection of threads and notions, and arranged her few books on the small bookshelf. Within days, a routine emerged, one built on mutual respect rather than obligation. They shared morning coffee in companionable silence, divided household tasks without discussion, and enjoyed evening television with commentary and laughter. "You should be charging me rent," Margaret said one evening as they shared a simple dinner of soup and fresh bread. Eleanor waved away the suggestion. "Your company is payment enough. Besides, I've been meaning to have some alterations done." She winked and they both laughed. But Eleanor, practical and forward-thinking, insisted that Margaret keep careful track of her sewing income. "Every dollar counts when you're rebuilding," she said firmly. "And you are rebuilding, Margaret. This is just a transition period." Margaret's sewing business began with small repairs for Eleanor's neighbors, hems, buttons, simple alterations. Her skilled hands had lost none of their precision, and word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Soon she was setting up appointments several days in advance, carefully scheduling around her physical therapy sessions for her healing hip. 6 weeks after moving in with Eleanor, Margaret received a notification from her bank. It was a mortgage statement for Caroline and Robert's house, showing the loan had been paid in full. Margaret's name appeared as a third-party interest in the property. She stared at the document in confusion. "I don't understand," she told Eleanor. "They had a 30-year mortgage. How could it be paid off already?" Eleanor studied the document with narrowed eyes. "Refinancing, maybe? Or an inheritance? Either way, this confirms your financial stake in that house. You should talk to a lawyer." The lawyer, a compassionate woman in her 50s, recommended by Eleanor's nephew, reviewed Margaret's documents with methodical attention. "The transfer wasn't formally designated as a loan or investment," she explained, "but it clearly wasn't an unconditional gift either. Given the circumstances and the substantial amount, we have a strong case for what's called unjust enrichment. At minimum, you're entitled to recover a percentage of your contribution, especially considering the recent change in the property's status." Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to sue my daughter." The lawyer nodded understandingly. "Let's start with a conciliation meeting. Sometimes just having professional representation changes the dynamic. While waiting for the legal process to unfold, Margaret continued rebuilding her life and her business. A neighborhood woman brought in her daughter's prom dress for alterations, then returned a week later with an unexpected request. "My niece is getting married in June," she explained, showing Margaret photos on her phone. "Nothing fancy, just a small ceremony in her parents' backyard. She needs something simple but beautiful." When I showed her the work you did on Jessie's dress, she asked if you might be interested in making her wedding dress. Margaret looked at the young woman's photo, early 20s, warm smile, practical eyes. "I haven't made a wedding dress in years," she admitted. She's not looking for anything elaborate, just something that makes her feel special. The bride-to-be, Amanda, visited the following Saturday. She sat in Eleanor's sunroom, describing her vision while Margaret sketched. Simple lines, modest embellishment, a design that honored tradition while acknowledging modern sensibilities. "My mother wore her grandmother's dress," Amanda explained, "but it was damaged in storage. I wanted something that captures that same timeless feeling." As Margaret worked on the wedding dress over the following weeks, something awakened in her, a creative confidence she thought had retired alongside her career. She sourced the perfect fabric, created multiple muslin prototypes, and hand-sewed delicate beadwork along the neckline. The dress took shape like a physical manifestation of her own restoration. Meanwhile, the date for the conciliation meeting approached. Margaret's lawyer had proposed a settlement amount of $80,000, slightly more than her original contribution, accounting for appreciation and interest. Caroline's lawyer had responded with indignation, insisting the money had been an unconditional gift with no expectation of repayment. "They're trying to intimidate us," Margaret's lawyer explained. "But the documentation is clear, and the timing of the eviction notice followed by the mortgage satisfaction is suspicious at best. We're in a strong position." The night before the meeting, Margaret sat at her sewing machine making final adjustments to Amanda's wedding dress. Her hands moved with practiced precision over the fabric, each stitch a small act of creation. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against the window, and Eleanor moved quietly in the kitchen preparing tea. The conciliation meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the county courthouse. Margaret arrived early with her lawyer, Karen Shepherd, and sat quietly reviewing their documentation. When Caroline and Robert entered with their attorney, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. Caroline didn't meet her eyes. "Let's begin," the mediator said once everyone was seated. "We're here to discuss financial matters regarding property at 247 Oak Ridge Lane." Karen presented their position first, her voice measured and professional. "Mrs. Winters provided $68,000 to $750 in 2018, specifically for the down payment on this property. While not formally documented as a loan, this substantial sum, representing most of Mrs. Winters' life savings, was clearly provided with the understanding that the home would, in part, provide security for her future needs." She placed the bank transfer receipt on the table. "My client lived independently until a hip fracture necessitated temporary assistance. After 6 weeks in her daughter's home, she received a formal eviction notice. Shortly thereafter, the mortgage on the property was satisfied in full, suggesting a significant change in financial circumstances." Caroline's lawyer leaned forward. "The funds were an unconditional gift from mother to daughter. There was no written agreement regarding repayment or equity stake. Mrs. Peterson and her husband allowed Mrs. Winters to stay in their home during her recovery as a courtesy, not an obligation." "A courtesy that ended with a legal eviction notice," Karen countered. "One doesn't typically evict family members receiving medical care unless there are extreme circumstances." Caroline finally spoke, her voice tight. "My mother disrupted our household routines. She couldn't adjust to our lifestyle." "By sitting on a sofa?" Margaret found herself asking, surprising everyone, including herself. Caroline flushed. "That was just one incident among many. You never respected our boundaries." The mediator intervened as tension escalated. "Let's focus on the financial aspect. Mrs. Winters is seeking compensation of $80,000, correct?" Karen nodded. "Given the property's appreciation and the years without interest, this represents a fair resolution." After 2 hours of negotiation, they reached an agreement, $70,000 paid in 2 installments over 6 months. As they signed the paperwork, Margaret searched her daughter's face for some glimmer of the girl who had once sat beside her sewing machine, learning to stitch straight seams and dreams together. Instead, she found only cool efficiency, Caroline signing her name with the same detached precision she applied to managing her household. When the meeting concluded, Margaret hoped Caroline might linger, might offer some personal word beyond the legal settlement. Instead, she watched her daughter and son-in-law exit quickly, already engaged in conversation about something else entirely, as though the dismantling of their family relationship had been merely another item on their day's agenda. "You did well," Karen said, gathering their documents. "The settlement is fair, is it?" Margaret asked quietly. "I'm not sure anything about this feels fair. The first installment arrived exactly on the specified date, cashier's check for $35,000, delivered by certified mail with no accompanying note. Margaret deposited it immediately and began house hunting with Eleanor's enthusiastic assistance. Nothing too large, Margaret instructed the realtor. Single-level, good natural light, preferably with a small garden area, and within walking distance of Eleanor's house if possible. They found it on the 3rd day, a modest 2-bedroom cottage on a quiet street just 4 blocks from Eleanor. The previous owner, an elderly professor moving to assisted living, had maintained it meticulously. Large windows in the front room, a compact but efficient kitchen, a small sunroom perfect for Margaret's sewing station, and a fenced backyard with established herb beds and a mature maple tree. "It's perfect," Margaret whispered during the showing, already imagining thread spools arranged on built-in shelves and morning coffee under the maple tree. The asking price was exactly what she could afford, with the settlement's first installment as down payment. Her offer was accepted the following day. "It's yours," Eleanor declared when they received confirmation. "Your new beginning." Margaret moved in gradually over several weeks, bringing her few possessions from Eleanor's house and carefully selecting new items for her fresh start. A small dining table with 2 comfortable chairs, a practical bed with a quality mattress that supported her healing hip, a compact sofa where she could sit however she pleased, even with her feet up while eating ice cream, directly from the container if she wanted. Her sewing business continued to flourish. Amanda's wedding dress had been completed and delivered, generating tearful appreciation from the bride and 3 new client referrals. Margaret converted the 2nd bedroom into a proper workroom with built-in storage, excellent lighting, and a custom cutting table at the perfect height to prevent back strain. On moving day, Robert delivered Margaret's remaining belongings from their house, mostly seasonal clothes and a few boxes of memorabilia she hadn't taken initially. He carried everything inside with the same polite efficiency he'd shown when loading her things into Eleanor's car months earlier. "Caroline wanted me to let you know that the kids might visit sometime," he said awkwardly as he prepared to leave. "If that's okay with you," Margaret nodded. "They're always welcome here." She watched him drive away, struck by the strange formality of his visit, as though he were delivering packages to a stranger, rather than helping his mother-in-law settle into her new home. The distance between them seemed both geographical and emotional, measured in miles and missed opportunities. 2 weeks later, Emma appeared at Margaret's door on a Saturday afternoon, shifting nervously from foot to foot on the porch. "Grandma, tell me, is it okay if I visit for a while?" Margaret welcomed her with a careful hug, noting how her granddaughter had grown taller in the months since they'd last seen each other. "I'm so happy you came. Would you like some lemonade? I just made it this morning." They sat in the small backyard beneath the maple tree's dappled shade. Emma spoke hesitantly at first, then with increasing animation about school, friends, her interest in environmental science. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions that invited further sharing rather than closing conversations. "The house feels different since you left," Emma admitted eventually. "Quieter somehow. Mom and Dad work late a lot. Michael stays in his room most of the time. And what about your mom? How is she doing?" Emma shrugged. "Busy. She redecorated the living room again. The new sofa is gone. She said it wasn't practical with teenagers in the house." A small smile flickered across her face. "Dad spilled coffee on it the week after you left. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret gave Emma a tour of her sewing room. "I'm working on a quinceañera dress for Mrs. Alvarez's daughter," she explained, showing Emma the partially completed bodice with its intricate beadwork. Emma ran her fingers gently over the fabric. "This is beautiful, Grandma. I didn't know you could make things like this. Would you like to learn? I could teach you some basic stitches if you're interested." Emma's face brightened. "Really? Mom always says she doesn't have time to show me things like that." Margaret found a scrap of cotton fabric and set up a simple project, a small drawstring bag that would teach straight seams, turning corners and creating a casing. She guided Emma's hands with gentle suggestions rather than corrections, encouraging experimentation and celebrating small successes. When Emma left that evening, she carried her completed project and a promise to return the following Saturday. "Maybe Michael will come too next time," she said hopefully. True to her word, Emma returned the following weekend, with Michael reluctantly in tow. The 15-year-old maintained his distance initially, responding to Margaret's questions with monosyllabic answers while keeping his attention focused on his phone. But when Margaret mentioned needing help hanging a small shelf in her sewing room, he volunteered with surprising eagerness. "Dad showed me how to use a drill last summer," he explained, measuring carefully before marking the wall. "We built a doghouse, but then Mom said we couldn't get a dog because it would mess up the yard." By the end of the visit, Michael had fixed a squeaky hinge on Margaret's back door, adjusted the washing machine's uneven feet, and promised to help install a rain barrel under the maple tree's downspout on his next visit. The children's visits became a weekend ritual. Sometimes they came together, sometimes separately, but always with increasing comfort and familiarity. Michael installed the promised rain barrel, then built a small bench beneath the maple tree. Emma progressed from simple drawstring bags to more complex projects, beaming with pride when Margaret praised her even stitches and creative fabric choices. "You have a natural talent for this," Margaret told her one afternoon as they worked side by side at the sewing table. "Just like your mother used to have." Emma looked up in surprise. "Mom used to sew?" "Oh, yes. When she was about your age, she made most of her own clothes. She had quite a gift for design, always adapting patterns to make them uniquely hers." "She never told me that," Emma said quietly. "She always buys everything from those expensive boutiques now." Margaret nodded, remembering the teenage Caroline, who had once declared she would become a fashion designer, sketching outfits during school lunch breaks and experimenting with fabrics on weekends. Somewhere along the way, that creative, ambitious girl had transformed into a woman who measured her worth through possessions rather than creations. The second installment of the settlement arrived precisely 6 months after the first, again by certified mail without personal note. Margaret used a portion to replace her aging sewing machine with a computerized model that could handle heavier fabrics and complex embroidery patterns. The remainder she set aside as emergency savings, a buffer against future uncertainty. Her business continued to grow primarily through word-of-mouth referrals. The wedding dress she'd created for Amanda had been photographed for a local magazine's feature on budget-conscious celebrations, bringing a steady stream of brides seeking custom gowns at reasonable prices. Margaret specialized in transforming vintage dresses into contemporary designs, preserving sentimental elements while creating wearable, modern garments. Eleanor visited often, bringing fresh herbs from her garden and community news. They took weekly walks to the farmers' market, attended free concerts in the park, and occasionally splurged on matinee movies followed by early bird dinner specials. Margaret discovered the pleasure of setting her own schedule, making decisions based solely on her preferences rather than others' expectations. One Saturday morning, as Margaret watered her herb garden, she noticed a familiar car driving slowly past her house. Caroline, alone behind the wheel, seemed to be studying the property. Their eyes met briefly before Caroline accelerated away. The encounter, though lasting only seconds, left Margaret unsettled for hours afterward. That evening, she finally addressed the lingering pain with Eleanor over tea in the sunroom. "I keep waiting to feel closure," Margaret admitted, "but it never quite comes. How do you reconcile with someone who doesn't acknowledge any wrongdoing?" Eleanor considered this as she added honey to her tea. "Sometimes reconciliation isn't possible, at least not in the way we imagine it should be. Some fractures can only heal with permanent changes to the structure. That's not very comforting, Margaret said with a sad smile. No, but it's honest. The question isn't whether Caroline will ever acknowledge her behavior or apologize. The question is whether you can find peace regardless of what she does or doesn't do. A few days later, Margaret was working on a client's formal gown when her doorbell rang. Opening the door, she found Michael standing on her porch, backpack slung over one shoulder. Expression unusually serious. "Grandma, can I talk to you about something important?" They sat at her small kitchen table while Michael explained his situation. He had been accepted to the State University's engineering program, but was struggling with his parents' expectations. "Dad wants me to go to his alma mater across the country," he explained. "He's already talking about the alumni connections and the fraternity I should join. Mom keeps showing me apartments near campus that cost more than your entire house." Margaret listened attentively, recognizing the familiar pattern, Caroline and Robert imposing their vision rather than supporting their sons. "What do you want, Michael?" she asked simply. He looked startled by the question, as though no one had bothered to ask before. "I want to stay close to home. The state program is actually better for environmental engineering, and I could save money by commuting at least the first year." "Have you told them this?" "I tried, but they don't really listen. Dad says I'm just afraid of being independent, and Mom says the state school doesn't have the right social environment, whatever that means." Margaret considered her response carefully. Sometimes parents project their own dreams onto their children. It doesn't mean they don't love you, just that they've confused what they want for you with what you want for yourself. How do I make them understand without causing a huge fight? You might start by helping them see this is a thoughtful decision, not a reactive one. Perhaps create a presentation comparing programs, costs, and outcomes. Approach it as you would an engineering problem, with data and analysis. Michael nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Dad always says decisions should be data-driven in his business meetings." When he left that afternoon, Margaret felt a profound sense of privilege, that her grandson had trusted her with his concerns, that she could offer perspective without imposing direction. It was a delicate balance she wished she had mastered earlier in life. 2 weeks later, Emma arrived for her regular sewing lesson with unexpected news. Michael got Mom and Dad to agree to the State University. He made this whole presentation with charts and everything. Dad was really impressed. Margaret smiled. "I'm glad they listened to him. And guess what else? Mom asked if I showed you the dress I'm making." Margaret raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Your mother mentioned your sewing." Emma nodded. "She asked if you were teaching me. Then she said she used to make her own clothes when she was my age." Emma paused, arranging fabric pieces on the cutting mat. "Do you think she might want to see what I'm making sometime?" "I think she might," Margaret replied carefully. "Would you like to invite her?" The following Saturday, Margaret was preparing tea when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Emma and Caroline standing on her porch. Caroline looked uncomfortable, clutching her purse strap with white knuckles. "Emma wanted me to see her project," she explained stiffly. Margaret stepped aside. "Please come in. I just made fresh tea." The next hour unfolded with careful navigation of neutral topics. Emma proudly displayed the skirt she was making, explaining techniques and choices with growing confidence. Caroline asked appropriate questions, occasionally offering suggestions that revealed her dormant knowledge of sewing. As Emma disappeared into the sewing room to retrieve her pattern book, an awkward silence fell between mother and daughter. "Your house is nice," Caroline finally said, glancing around the sunlit kitchen. "It suits you." "Thank you," Margaret replied. "I'm happy here." Another silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken history and unresolved pain. Neither seemed capable of bridging the gap with more meaningful conversation. When Emma returned, Caroline stood abruptly. "We should go. Dad's expecting us for lunch." At the door, Caroline hesitated. "The children enjoy visiting you. They've mentioned coming for Thanksgiving, if that would be all right." "They're always welcome here," Margaret said, the same words she had offered Robert months earlier. "And so are you and Robert if you'd like to come." Caroline nodded without commitment and turned toward her car. As Margaret watched them drive away, she felt a complicated mix of emotions, lingering hurt, cautious hope, and a newfound certainty that regardless of what happened with Caroline, She had created a life of value and meaning. That evening, Margaret sat on her small porch swing, watching fireflies rise from her garden in the gathering dusk. Eleanor had joined her for a simple dinner, and they now sat in companionable silence, listening to distant children's laughter and the gentle creak of the swing's chains. "You know what I realized today?" Margaret said eventually. "When Caroline told me that's not your place all those months ago, she was right, just not in the way she meant it." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "That house, that life, it wasn't my place. Not because I didn't deserve to sit on an expensive sofa, but because I deserve to sit wherever I choose in my own home, on my own terms." Margaret gestured toward her modest front garden, with its careful arrangement of perennials, the porch with its mismatched but comfortable furniture, the warm light spilling from windows that needed no designer curtains. "This is my place. Not because of what it cost or how it looks to others, but because here I can exist fully without apology or explanation. Here I can welcome my grandchildren and teach them skills their parents have forgotten to value."